all the time, make it go backwards. And, in my mind, we know the things about Hezekiah, but that's one thing that always stuck out in my mind. But as I was studying for this, it astounded me the amount of scripture that is devoted to Hezekiah's life. He's covered in 2 Kings, he's covered in 2 Chronicles, he's covered in the book of Isaiah. Now the question, when you look at the books of Kings, it is the Chronicle of the Kings that they're talking about, the kings of all of them really, but primarily of the northern kingdom, I'm sure. But that was Chronicles, the Chronicles of the Kings. Then the king had the book of the Kings. Why would a prophet be speaking so much about Hezekiah? He was a righteous king, but there's one other thing. He lived during the time of Hezekiah. And when Hezekiah had a problem, he went to Isaiah. And Isaiah was the one who brought the message from God that says, get your house in order, you're going to die. And if you look at, and Daryl and I were talking earlier, if you look at some of the parts of those two stories as they're told, or in three different books, you will find things that are said verbatim between Isaiah and one of the other books. And it just really astounded me the amount of coverage when you look at that Hezekiah had. Okay, we're going to start with in 2 Chronicles 27, verse 9. Let me see if I can get the PowerPoint here to go. Get it up here. Okay. Hezekiah was born about 740 BC. And to back into that, you can come up with some things by looking at history. And his kingship reign, he reigned between 715 BC and 686 BC. So if he came at 25, you go back through that. And it was around 739 or 740 whenever he became king. And that's what the books or the history tells us. He's covered in, like I said, 2 Kings, but it's chapters 18 through 20, 2 Chronicles 29 through 32, and Isaiah 36 through 39. So Isaiah wrote 4 chapters about Hezekiah. What do we know about Hezekiah? Starting off in 2 Chronicles, we find out that he was the son of Ahaz. Ahaz was the king before him. And what kind of king was Ahaz? Was he a good king? Was he a bad king? He was evil. He wasn't only evil, he was bad, very evil. Whenever it came to the point of burying him, and they talk about this at the end of whenever he's announced in chapter, I think it was, back up here, in Chronicles 28, he was not buried with the kings in the way that his son was. He was buried in the tomb of the kings. But Hezekiah, the ones that were righteous kings, the one that came through the lineage of David, were buried, and Hezekiah was buried in the upper section of the tombs of the sons of David, and all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem honored him. His father was not honored. His mother was Abijah, and is listed as the daughter of Zechariah. Now, Zechariah, there were lots of Zechariahs. It could have been a prophet. It could have been a high priest. But when you see how bad his father was, and then you see how righteous Hezekiah is, and then who was his son? His son was Manasseh. Was Manasseh a righteous king or not? He was evil to begin with, but toward the end of his life, he did change. So how does a righteous man fit in there? Having had such a wicked father who, going through the things, it says his dad walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He had made molten images, of Baal. He burned incense in the valley of Ben Hinnom. He burned his sons, and he only had one, in the fire. He sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. He sacrificed to the gods of Damascus. Interesting there in that story about that. He sacrificed to the gods of Damascus because they beat him in a fight. Damascus beat him. And so he decided, I'm going to worship those kings so I can win. It didn't turn out well for him, though. And you can read about that in chapter 28, verse 23. He made altars for himself in every corner of Jerusalem. And he closed the doors to the house of the Lord. Hezekiah reigned about 16, Ahaz reigned about 16 years. And I got to thinking about that. Think about not being able to go to worship the God of heaven for 16 years, at least not openly. You couldn't offer your sacrifices. You couldn't go to, there was no Passover. There was nothing. The temple was shut. Idolatry was out. It was being practiced. And why Hezekiah? Why Hezekiah all of a sudden this oasis in the middle of evil? I think it was his mother. Nothing is said. But if she was the daughter of a high priest or the daughter of a prophet, she probably had some knowledge. And it showed me that a righteous woman can do a lot in raising a kid. Okay, we did that right there. Was Hezekiah, and I'm giving you the answer, a good king? Of course. Look at what is said there about him. In the first one there, both 2 Kings 18:3 and 2 Chronicles 29:2, those are verbatim. That is exactly the same thing said. He did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father David had done. In 2 Chronicles 34, it said, he did right in the sight of the Lord and walked in the ways of his father David and did not turn aside to the right or to the left. He's referenced with David. How was David referred to by Samuel? A man after God's own heart. Whenever Samuel told Saul, you're no longer going to be king. It's going to be given to somebody that has a heart after God. So doesn't this make Hezekiah a man after God's own heart? Even though he's not listed that way. Abraham was referred to as a friend of God. David was a man after God's own heart. Does that exclude anybody else from having those associations with God? Can two people walk together except they be agreed? To walk with God, what do we have to do? Seek God's favor. Think about, and I have to go back and think which one of them it was, that Enoch. Enoch walked with God. And what happened to him? Taken up to heaven. Elijah saw the chariots of fire and the horses, took him up into the clouds. It doesn't say anything about whether they were a friend of God, whether they were this or that. But by nature of the fact that they left this earth in a supernatural way, they had to be righteous. And I think that today, as back in that day and throughout the history of the world, there were men that were after God's heart. And we can be that way. We need to be that as well. We may not be given that same title, but we can be that way. Okay, we're going to look at Hezekiah cleansing the temple. And this is in 2 Chronicles 28 that I took this basic information from, or 29, excuse me. Whenever he became king, the very first thing, it says here in the first month, he set about to do these things. Now remember, the temple has been boarded up for 16 years. So here you have a man that's going in there and he says, we're going to open this thing up. 25 years old. That's not very old. At least from my perspective, it's not. And sometimes you wonder about 25-year-olds being able to do the things, and they are young men and young ladies at that age. But having been raised in such a wicked environment, here he decides, I want to do this. And he said, I want to make a covenant with God. He gets all the high priests together, or he gets the Levites and the priests together, and he tells them, you have to consecrate yourself. They hadn't been consecrated in who knows how long. They couldn't offer a sacrifice to God in the way that they were. So he began on the first day of the first month, and it took him 8 days before they were consecrated. 8 days. I don't know what all they had to go through, but I'm sure there were some sacrifices and some, well, I don't know. I don't want to get involved in that because I don't know. Then once he gets them consecrated, then he wants to open up the temple for worship. But the temple's been closed for a long time. They opened the doors. And one of the scriptures that I read said that the Levites carried out all the stuff, the bad stuff out, and dumped it into the brook of Kidron that ran through Jerusalem. A waste dump at this point in time for them. I can't imagine what was there, the heathen activities that were going on, there's no doubt. But they got it cleaned out, and they got the consecration finished on the 16th day of the month. It took them 16 days to get themselves consecrated and to get the temple open and ready. And to restore the temple worship. In 2 Chronicles 29, they brought, now listen to what they offered as sacrifices. 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, 7 male goats for a sin offering. They were The priest had to do this. They had to slaughter the animals. They had to get them done. They had to clean the altar first. That's what they were doing previously, cleaning the altar, cleaning the thing out to offer the things. And when they had gotten it ready, and looking here at the last part of what you're seeing on the screen, it impressed me that what they did, and we're going to read these. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and harps with lyres according to the commandment of David. We talk about mechanical instruments of music, and we don't use them because we don't have authority. But the Jews did. Remember that the first instruments were what? That were used by Moses made. Were trumpets. He gave instructions for how they were going to be used, what sound to be made for this, what sound to be made for that. And as David came on the scene, God gave him the permission and he changed what was being used. But they still used trumpets, as we'll see here. That the Levites stood with the musical instruments of David and the priest with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah gave the order to offer the burnt offerings on the altar, and when the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord also began with the trumpets accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. While the whole assembly worshiped, the singers also sang and the trumpet sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Now at the completion of the burnt offerings, and the king and all who were present with him bowed down and worshiped. Can you imagine? Not been able to do that for 16 years, and now they do it. But what I have underlined there, to me, is important because he did what David had prescribed. And David says, the things I got from the Spirit. They were done by that. And so Hezekiah restores the temple worship, and there he responds back to David again that Hezekiah and the officials ordered the Levites to sing praises to the Lord with the words of David and Asaph the seer. All of it, what Hezekiah is doing, is per Scripture. And I think that's a wonderful thing for us to realize that he did. He also restored Passover. What was Passover? Passover was a feast time to honor the time that God passed over the firstborn in the houses that had the blood back in Egypt before they left. And they were to do this how often? Every year the first of the month, on I think the 14th day of the month. And it was to be done perpetually. In fact, Jesus, the night that he was betrayed, partook of his last Passover. And if you think about it, it was the last Passover before the church came into being. Now, there were other Passovers, but God was on a different thing at that point in time. So he restored the Passover that all of them needed. And he even invited those from other tribes, and some of them chided him, but some from Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar. And if you want to look, if you've got your list of questions, Rachel had one at number 15 on the first page there. It says, what did the Lord do in response to Hezekiah's prayer for the people who ate the Passover even though they were unclean? You could not eat Passover if you were unclean. And if you go back to Numbers, there is a story that some men came to him at the time of the Passover and said, we have been defiled by a body. We can't take Passover. What are we supposed to do? And Moses went to God, and God said, do it the second month. This is what they did. They did Passover in the second month. But what you have here, you have some people that are in the other tribes that are defiled. And Hezekiah makes a prayer to God for them. And God hears that prayer, and he heals them, and he allows them to take Passover the way they should. Now, the next part of Hezekiah's life, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time in this, because one, I don't have a whole lot of time, but Sennacherib, who was the king of Assyria, came against Judah and took 40 of their cities. And Hezekiah tried to go out and he offered him something. He said, look, I know I haven't done things. And he offered him gold. And he took it. But then he still sent people, Rabshakeh being one of his lieutenants, against him. And he attacked Judah on the 14th day in the year of Hezekiah. Now, he's already been king for 14 years. How long did he reign? 29. He came up against Assyria and the fortified cities. And like I said, Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib intended to take Jerusalem. And he diverted water from 2 Chronicles 32, verses 3 and verse 30, from the place that was there up into the city so that the Assyrians could not have water. And Rabshakeh, being the man who was the front man for Sennacherib at this time, as we remember having, he came out to Jerusalem, and he tried to get Jerusalem to cave and not fight. He didn't want to fight them, but he would. He had to. And he sent envoys with a letter, basically saying, I'm going to take you. You think your God's going to save you? I've beaten all the other gods. I will beat your God. He defied the God of Israel. Now, I show you this. This is called the prism, the Taylor prism of King Sennacherib. On this prism, he gives some information. The king had this recorded, and it was done about 691 BC. And he made 3 of them. There's one in Chicago. There's this one right here is in Great Britain, the British Museum. There's one more, and I forget where it's at. But they're all very, very similar, tell the same basic story. Sennacherib tells about part of his fight against Judah. And I put this in for the reason that sometimes we get the idea, did these things really happen? Yes. What you're reading about in the Bible here really happened, and there's a king that tried to tell of his exploits against it to prove that it did. And I think that's interesting. But during this time, it says here, as these things were going on, during the time of Sennacherib's campaign, Isaiah made the trip to see Hezekiah. And he told him, the Lord has said, get your affairs in order. You're going to die and not live. Think about that. What if you were told by a prophet, if we had any, but we don't, or a holy man that says, God has told me, and you live back at this time, that you're fixing to die. And you're only 30 years old, give or take. Wait, let's see, about 40. You're going to die. What would you think? Is there a way out? What did Hezekiah do? He prayed to God. He didn't only pray to God. He turned his back, he turned to the wall, and he said, I beseech thee, O God, O Lord, remember now how I have walked before thee in truth and with a perfect heart, and have done that which is good in thy sight. And it says he wept sorely. This wasn't just a crying against the wall and just sobbing a little bit. This talks about wailing and crying out loud and great amounts of tears. And the interesting thing that's always been in my mind is that before Isaiah got out of the courtyard, after delivering this message, God taps him on the shoulder, so to speak, and says, go back and tell Hezekiah, I've seen your tears. I will heal you. What does that tell us about tears? Tears are a necessary thing. We are emotional beings. Some of us more so than others. Who else wept? Jesus wept. And if you read what is talked about in Hebrews about Jesus, it sounds a whole like what Hezekiah did. I'm sorry? Peter wept. Other men have wept. It's nothing wrong with it. Jesus wept just at the tomb of Lazarus. But it tells God something about us, how strong our feelings are. And Hezekiah went to God, and God spared him. And he also told him, I will add to you to thy days 15 years, and I will deliver thee and this city out of the hands of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. Hezekiah had said, Lord, because when he got this announcement from Sennacherib, he went to God. He laid it all out and he said, here's what this man is saying, and he is defying you. You need to do something about that to save your name and your reputation. And God told him here, I will do that. I will defend it for my sake and for David's sake. Now, asking for a sign makes me wonder. You have the faith that Hezekiah has to go out, start doing all these things to building it up. You're told, you cry to the Lord, you say, Lord, I don't want to die. And the Lord comes back and says, okay, you won't. Would you have the guts to say, the Lord, prove to me that you're not going to, that you're going to do this? I want a sign from you. I want you to show me that what you're saying to me will come about. What kind of faith did he have? Was his faith a little bit take a hit or something? I really don't know. I wondered. But what does Isaiah offer him? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, could be. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. That could be. Yeah. I mean, we want assurances whenever we pray to God for things. We've all had prayers that were answered. We've all had prayers that were delayed, some of them not even answered at times. But I've never had that come back at me from one, and we won't, because God doesn't work that way now. But what did Hezekiah choose? Isaiah said, look, you want me to have the sundial, make it look like sun's going down faster, or not going down as fast, it goes backwards. And Hezekiah said, make it go backwards. And what did God allow the prophet to do? He did that. Now, what I don't know, and I don't think there's any way for anybody to know, is did time go backwards by whatever amount that was? I don't know. I've heard theories that yes, it did. And then you have the thing when Joshua stopped the sun and the moon and said, stand still, for about the space of a day or half a day or something like that. What happened? I don't know. I'm going to leave that with God. Hezekiah revives and he continues on. And from that point on, he lived another 15 years. God added 15 years to him. But as he got to the end of his life, things changed, I think, a little bit for Hezekiah because of the incident with the envoys from Babylon. And the king that was there, the son of the king, and I'm going to try Merodach Baladan, who was the son of Baladan the king, sent letters to Hezekiah. He had heard that Hezekiah was sick, wasn't doing good. So he sent letters of encouragement to him. And Hezekiah invited him down, apparently, or I don't know how that worked, but he did when he got there. He showed him what? Yeah. Here's a potential enemy. Hey, I'm going to show you something. Here, look at what I've got here in this closet. I've got all this stuff here. And they did. They had stuff over the years that had come about. But he shows him everything he had. What does that sound like? Sounds like a man built up with a lot of pride. That this was my stuff. He knew better. And Isaiah comes to him and says, what happened? And he told him. He said, well, what did you show him? He said, I showed him everything. Showed him everything. And when he said, and Isaiah prophesied to him that you have done something, and what's going to happen is that some of your descendants, your direct descendants, will be taken away whenever Judah is taken away in the future. And they will serve other kings. Now, we have the story of Daniel, and Daniel was one of those type of persons. I don't know whether he was in the lineage of Hezekiah or not. I don't know. But what Hezekiah did here did not help that situation. He was a good king. And here's some takeaways that I thought of, and if you have some others. Though a person has wicked influences in his family like Hezekiah did, you can still become a faithful servant of God. You have a bad daddy, a bad mother, a bad brother, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'm not judged by what my daddy did or didn't do. And my sons won't be judged by what I do. I'll be judged. of what I do and how I respond to God. Secondly, a godly mother can have a very big influence. Quite often does. Sometimes has a bigger influence than what a father does. His prayer being answered is proof that God answers the prayers those prayers mean something to God. A righteous man that prays to God is going to be heard. Now, will he say yes or no? I don't know. He had pride over what he had here, and even though this stuff wasn't his, he wasn't a good steward of what God had given that kingdom. By showing it off, it may have helped hasten that downfall. I don't know for sure. We talked about God answering prayers. I think it means our tears mean something. You know, we shed tears for joy, for pain, for sadness. Babies do it to let you know what's wrong, or at least tell you something is wrong. They're necessary. And God knows they are, and God gave them to us for a reason. And the last thing that I'm going to have here, that we should be lifted up by the things that we have from God. They're not mine. We studied it sometime back in that we are stewards. What God has given me is God's. It's not mine. I don't have the right to do with it. Hezekiah, it made it sound like that was his, but it really wasn't. Does anybody have any other takeaways? Class is over. Thank you very much. And enjoy.
Again, welcome our visitors that we have with us tonight. We do have visitors. We're glad that you're here. And as we announce every Wednesday, since we're still congregating in the auditorium with no separate Bible classes, we end our Bible class with singing some vacation Bible school songs, and before we can have our invitation. So we'll do that right now. The Lord is in this holy temple. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Keep silent. Wonderful, wonderful, Jesus is to me. Counselor, Prince of Peace, mighty God I see. Save me, keep me from my sin and shame. Wonderful is my Redeemer, praise his name. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, Jesus is to me. Counselor, Prince of Peace, mighty God I see. Save me, keep me from my sin and shame. Wonderful is my Redeemer, praise his name. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, Jesus is to me. Counselor, Prince of Peace, mighty God I see. Save me, keep me from my sin and shame. Wonderful is my Redeemer, praise his name. Very good. Let's do the invitation. Brother Sam.
No, Jeff is hoping that my invitation is as short as that song is right there. Get through it real fast. Sorry, Jeff. You know, it's good to have a good meal. When my mother was alive, I lived with her several years. And boy, at supper time, I just enjoyed the smell in the house. But more than that, I enjoyed that good dinner that we had. But you know, that took some effort. And there was a great reward there. When she was gone, and she's been gone several years, I try to cook every once in a while. And sometimes my son will come and visit me and his wife and my grandson. And I'll try to cook a big meal and everything. And boy, that takes quite a bit of effort. And occasionally I remember I would call Mother and say, I'm going to be late. I may not be there. I may just pick me up something. Well, she's prepared all this dinner. I didn't realize then what was entailed in that. And sometimes I've cooked stuff, and Sam calls up and says, I'm playing ball. I won't be there. So there I've got big meal, as I call it, a big meal prepared. And it's just sort of aggravating. The Lord has prepared us a meal, a great feast. We have the opportunity to come to Him. He's issued a great invitation to us. In Luke, the 14th chapter, He tells a parable. He said a man was giving a big dinner, and he invited many. And at that dinner hour, he sent his slave or his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. Come. But they all alike began to make excuses. One said that I bought a tract of land. I need to go see it. Another said, I bought 5 yoke of oxen and I need to go test them. So I can't come, please excuse me. Apparently they were nice and saying, oh, I can't come, but I appreciate the invitation, but I can't come to the feast. Another said, I've married a wife, I can't come. And so it was reported to the master. Then the head of the household became angry and said to his slave, go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in here the poor and the crippled and blind and lame. And the slave said, Master, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the slave, go out into the highways and along the hedges and compel them to come in, so that my house may be filled. Compel them, persuade, talk to, encourage, get them to come into my dinner, because there's still room, and he wants it filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste of my dinner. It doesn't matter how nice they were in refusing the invitation. They're not going to be acceptable. The great invitation that the Lord gave, one of them is recorded in Matthew, the 11th chapter, beginning in verse 25. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent, and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for this way was well-pleasing in your sight. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father. Nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone whom the Son wills to reveal him. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He offers the great invitation to come to heaven, to come to him, to come where he is and where God is, where the Holy Spirit are, where the apostles are, those saints who have gone before us, where our faithful loved ones are waiting. But if we refuse that, if we come up with some excuses, remember that's what they are. They're excuses. And they'll keep us out of heaven. They'll keep us away from the dinner that's prepared for us. Come to the feast if you're subject to the gospel call tonight as we stand and sing.